Okay, so big one, the big two sections of the nervous system, sensory system and the motor system are coming up. Let's begin with the sensory system. We are going to follow this path in discussion. We'll start with the introduction, then we discuss the laws for the encoding of information in the CNS, in the sensory system particularly. Then the receptor physiology, ascending tracts in the spinal cord, cortex, and finally the physiology of pain. I have put physiology of pain separately because there are lots of aspects which are to be understood as concepts, and questions are asked very often on the pain. So I'm taking it separately. Right. So let's begin by very basic fundamentals. There are two types of sensations, the general senses and the special senses. Let's start with the very basic. General senses like touch, pain, pressure, temperature, whereas the special senses, there are 5 special senses: vision, hearing, taste, smell and equilibrium. And sometimes some people talk about the sixth sense as well. However, we will deal with special senses in a separate section, because there is a fundamental difference between these two. Special senses, they have a specialized end organ. For instance, for vision there are eyes, hearing the ears, whereas general senses can arise from any part of the body. Then special senses have cranial nerves designated for them, whereas general senses can be carried by any sensory nerve to take that sense to the cortex. So that's a difference, and therefore special senses will be a separate category. We will have a separate chapter for that. So in this particular section we are dealing with general senses, and therefore the first point that I want to highlight is any sensation starting from any part of the body is carried by a 3-neuron path into the CNS. There is a 3-neuron path that we must understand. First neuron starts from the receptor at the periphery. Receptor is a specialized end organ which receives a particular sensation. So the sensation starts with the receptor at the periphery, and the first neuron starting from there enters the spinal cord. That's the first neuron. It ends in the spinal cord. In some cases, first neuron goes all the way to the medulla, upper medulla, as we will discuss later. But generally speaking, receptor to spinal cord, the first neuron. Second neuron crosses the midline and ascends upward, and it relays in thalamus. So the second neuron, spinal cord to thalamus. Signals are finally reaching the higher centers, and the third neuron starting from the thalamus goes to the sensory cortex in the parietal lobe. That's a 3-neuron path which carries any sensation from the periphery to the cortex. Receptor to spinal cord to thalamus, thalamus to cortex. Sensory cortex in the parietal lobe. Now, a few things should be noted at this point. Thalamus is the obligate relay station for all the general and special senses. well, here we are discussing the general sensations, but it's true for even the special senses. Any sense starting from the periphery has to go through the thalamus to reach the cortex. Okay, so thalamus is the obligate relay station, and needless to say, only when the signals reach cortex do we actually feel that sensation. I'll give you an example. When we touch a hot object, a hot utensil, there are two sensations involved in it: heat and touch. But if you notice, we feel the touch, and then after a fraction of a second we feel the heat, we feel the temperature. Why is that? There were two sensations involved in this. They started from the same point of the body and they started at the same time, and yet we feel the touch first and heat little later, if you have ever experienced this. The reason is reaching of signals to the cortex. Touch will reach faster to the cortex, touch will reach first to the cortex, heat reaches later. And why is that? We will discuss it little later, but this will give you an idea as to why knowing this pathway and reaching of cortex is important. Only when the signals reach cortex do we actually feel the sense. Right, now coming back to the thalamus. Thalamus is the obligate relay station. All the general and special senses are relayed via thalamus to the cortex, except one, except olfaction. Except the sense of smell, all other general and special senses have to go through the thalamus. So please remember, except the olfactory sense, and we will see lots of exceptions in the case of olfactory sense in the due course of time. So if ever a question is asked asking except something, you might first think of the olfaction. There are lots of exceptions in the olfactory sense. However, this is the 3-neuron path, and thalamus is the obligate relay station for all the sensory information. It's the sensory information we are talking about. Why am I pressing on this point? Is because thalamus has specific relay nuclei and specific sensations are relayed via those nuclei. But there are 3 nuclei of the thalamus which are involved in motor function. There was a question like this: which of the following thalamic nuclei is involved in the motor function? So there are 3 thalamic nuclei which are involved in the motor function, and those nuclei are ventro-anterior, ventrolateral and centromedian. Please remember these 3 nuclei: ventro-anterior, ventrolateral, centromedian. Ventro-anterior, ventrolateral, centromedian. 3 nuclei involved in motor function. They are connected with the cerebellum and basal ganglia. You know, cerebellum and basal ganglia are those parts which are involved in the motor activity. So these 3 nuclei are connected to cerebellum and basal ganglia, and in that sense they are involved in the motor function. So remember, otherwise thalamus is supposed to convey the sensory information coming from various parts of the body, general senses, special senses, except for those 3 nuclei of the thalamus. How do we get to know about the various intensities? Is it by changing the action potential frequency? Because nerves are carrying only one thing, action potentials. So how will we know about the intensities, or whether there will be change in action potential amplitude with different intensities, or action potential duration? Okay, the answer was action potential frequency. How do we get to know about the different intensities is by changing the action potential frequencies. This applies for everywhere in the body. I mean, consider the example of baroreceptors and then we'll talk about this. Baroreceptors detect the blood pressure. Now, whether the blood pressure has increased or decreased and how much increase or decrease has happened, all this information, how will the baroreceptors convey to the vasomotor center? Because they are generating only the action potentials. So how this entire information will be conveyed? By action potential frequency. Let's say at 100 mm of Hg, there was a certain impulse discharge frequency or action potential frequency generated by the baroreceptors. When the blood pressure increases, this impulse discharge frequency also increases. When the blood pressure decreases, this impulse discharge frequency also decreases. And increase or decrease is happening in a corresponding way. I mean, slight increase in the blood pressure, slight increase in the action potential frequency. Great increase in the blood pressure, much more increase in the action potential frequency, and that is how. So this is called as frequency modulated signaling in the CNS. Most of our functions are based on frequency modulated signaling. Anyways, the first point that you must understand is intensity discrimination occurs by changes in action potential frequency. Now, the only thing that is to be understood is what is the scale with which this action potential frequency changes. I mean, for feather touch, there will be one action potential frequency conveyed to the cortex. For a crude touch, the frequency will increase. For heavy touch, the action potential frequency will further increase. But what is the scale with which this change happens? For that, there is a law. We are talking about coding and the laws governing the coding of information. The law is Weber-Fechner's law. It states this action potential frequency changes with logarithmic scale. Yes, it talks about the logarithmic scale. It says perception felt by the cortex, that is S, is proportional to log of the actual intensity applied at the periphery, that's I. So I is actual intensity applied at the periphery and S is the perception felt by the cortex based on the action potential frequency that was generated by that intensity of stimulus. And K is proportionality constant. Now let's understand this law in detail. Let's say a touch of 10 units was applied at the periphery. So intensity of stimulus was 10 units. Log of 10 is 1. And let's say K, the constant, let's take it as 1. This is just an example. This is just an example to make us understand what this law is about. So let's take K, the constant, as 1. Now log of 10 is 1 into 1 is equal to 1. So perception by the cortex will be 1 unit. Now let's increase the actual intensity 10 times. Let's make it 100 units. The intensity applied at the periphery. Log of 100 is 2. 2 into 1 is equal to 2. So as per this law, when the actual intensity at the periphery is increased by 10 times, perception felt by the cortex gets doubled. Or look at it from the other way around. When the perception of the cortex gets doubled or the action potential frequency gets doubled, actual intensity has increased at the periphery by 10 times. And that is how cortex deciphers the information about the intensities applied. Well then, one more person came and said, no, this is not the correct scale. I will give you the correct scale. The name of the person was Steven and therefore the law came to know as Stevens power law. And it says it's not the logarithmic scale with which it changes with the power function of the intensity. So the law is S is equal to K into I raised to N. Action potential frequency changes with nth power of the actual intensity applied. That n is different for different sensations. So these are that's the law for intensity discrimination in the sensory system. Then there are other laws like Bell-Magendie law. In the CNS, the dorsal roots are sensory and ventral roots are motor. So these are some of the important laws. I'll just write it down. The last one which I mentioned just now, Bell-Magendie law. It says dorsal roots are for the spinal nerves. The dorsal roots are sensory and ventral roots are motor. Well, very basic type of law, but one must know it. Let's say sensation is coming from the periphery. It will enter through the dorsal horn in the spinal cord. And the motor fibers that start from the spinal cord, they arise from the ventral horn. So that's the Bell-Magendie law. So these are the laws governing the sensory information or encoding of sensory information in the CNS. Next, we will now discuss about the receptor physiology and the ascending tracts.